welcome back to the study. We finally ended Mark chapter 4, and we could have stayed there a lot longer, but we're going on to Mark chapter 5. We're going to look at this very first incident that happened after he crossed the sea. Of course, we talked about that last time, how Jesus was able to deal with nature in miraculous ways. Mark chapter 5, verse 1. They came to the other side of the sea, into the country of the Gerasenes. When he got out of the boat, immediately a man from the tombs with an unclean spirit met him. And he had his dwelling among the tombs, and no one was able to bind him any more, even with a chain, because he had often been bound with shackles and chains, and the chains had been torn apart by him, and the shackles broken into pieces, and no one was strong enough to subdue him. Constantly, night and day, he was screaming among the tombs and in the mountains, and gnashing himself with stones. It's an interesting personality here that Jesus encounters here. One of the things that we find here is the fact that we have a man who is obviously a demoniac. He is living in the cemetery. He is super strong compared to the other people in his community who tried to keep him from hurting himself and couldn't do that anymore because he was so strong. A demoniac influence can make people physically very strong. That does not mean that everyone who's very strong is a demoniac, by the way. The issue comes down to a few things. Interesting that the man cuts himself with stones, and the man screams, and he's obnoxious. He is a problematic character in the community. You would think getting rid of this guy would be the goal. Instead, it seemed to be that they actually tolerated his presence in their cemetery, shall we say. Maybe it's because they couldn't get a hold of him and throw him out. Maybe it's because they figured, hey, as long as he stays there, yeah, that's fine. Well, let's go on and keep reading. Seeing Jesus from a distance, he ran up and bowed down before him, and shouting with a loud voice, he said, "What business do we have with each other, Jesus, Son of the Most High God?" We have to understand this man understood who Jesus Christ was. And he didn't learn that in the newspapers or on the internet. There was no communication per se. And the word might have got around that there was different prophets and different preachers and different healers and different magicians, shall we call them. But to understand the articulation of Jesus' doctrine as the Son of God, that had to come from somewhere spiritual. That did not come from the daily news or the 6 o'clock television broadcast. I say that a little facetiously because we have a tendency to interpret this Eastern book, this Middle Eastern gospel, through Western mindset and Western ideals and Western culture and sociological parameters. He knew who Jesus was. That's interesting. He was definitely a demoniac. And he goes on to say, "I implore you by God," in other words, by Yahweh, the Father of Jesus Christ, "I implore you by God, do not torment me." In other words, I know you have the power to torment me, but please don't. Please don't. It's an interesting recognition of who Christ is and what he can do. Most people who aren't demoniacs don't have the ability to recognize Christ for who he is and what he can do. A lot to think about there. And he, Jesus, he said, and verse 8, I'm sorry, "For he had been saying to him, 'Come out of the man, you unclean spirit.' And he was asking him, 'What is your name?' And he, the demoniac, said to Jesus, 'My name is Legion,'" singular, my singular name is Legion, "for we are many," implying that there are many demons here. Satan always wants to look bigger and badder than he really is. The demons always want to scare you by numbers. One of the reasons why we should not judge the church as successful by numbers. Wish I had time to go there, but we won't. Verse 10, and he began to implore him earnestly not to send them out of the country. In other words, this demoniac says, don't send us out of the country. We like living here. This is where we belong. This is where we're comfortable. We're having a blast here, tormenting these people. And there was a large herd of swine feeding nearby on a mountain. And the demons implored him, saying, send us into the swine so that we may enter them. In other words, we can't have this guy. Put us in the pigs. We'll have a blast with the pigs. We'll tear this place apart with all those pigs. And interesting, these Jewish people shouldn't have been farming pigs. It was against their dietary regulations. That's another story too. So Jesus gave them permission, and coming out, the unclean spirits entered the swine, and the herd rushed down the steep bank into the sea, about 2,000 of them, and they were drowned in the sea. Apparently the pigs were smarter than the person. They knew that when they were possessed by demons, they had to die. People don't, for some strange reason. And it's good that they don't, and it's good in this situation that this demoniac was delivered by the power of Jesus Christ and by his ability to overcome and conquer demonic forces. These are things we need to learn from this passage. Their herdsmen of these pigs ran away and reported it to the city and the country, and the people came out to see what it was that had happened. They came to Jesus and observed the man who had been demon-possessed sitting down, clothed, and in his right mind. The very man who had the legion. And it says they became frightened. In other words, how did this happen? Oh my goodness. This is scary stuff. Halloween. Whatever. Those who described it to them, and those who had seen it described it to them and how it had happened to the demon-possessed man and all about the swine. Now here's the interesting part. Verse 17, the end of this story says, and they, the people who heard that, began to implore him, Jesus, to leave the region. Get out. Don't stay here anymore. Don't do those kind of tricks around us. We don't want that. That's where he was coming from. Now, this is very interesting. Sometimes we get so used to seeing demoniacs and demon activity amongst us. As long as it doesn't really affect us on a daily basis and it's confined to the cemetery of our lives, we get really used to it. And when it gets destroyed, when our life patterns get destroyed or get changed, we don't like the source of that. We don't understand the power that Jesus Christ has. We don't understand that we need deliverance, and that is what is best for us. It's really interesting. These people should have really accepted Christ as a deliverer of their community. Instead, they saw him as a destroyer of their swine, something they shouldn't have had to begin with. And they didn't like that. And their money got in the way of their spirituality, and their numbers and their product got in the way of what was best for them, even in their sociological setting, and of course their spiritual well-being. And they said, bye-bye, Jesus, we don't want you here.